Hi guys, today we will be starting with the life of Pi. We will be looking at the author's bio, historical background, the genre, the narrator, as well as the parts of the novel. Yann Martel was born in 1963 in Salamanca, Spain. His parents were diplomats and traveled to many places. During his childhood, he lived in many different countries, including Costa Rica, France, India, Iran, Mexico, Turkey, Canada, and the United States. His parents were of French-Canadian descent, and the family eventually settled in Montreal. At the age of 27, he became a full-time writer. It was while he was in India that he got the idea for Life of Pi and visited mosques, churches, temples, and zoos. He returned to Canada to research Christianity, Hinduism, Islam, animal psychology and behavior, and castaway stories. Life of Pi is his best-known novel and won the Man Booker Prize in 2002. It has been published in over 50 countries and has sold more than 12 million copies worldwide. Pondicherry was a French colony from 1674 until it was transferred to the Indian government in 1954. The Pondicherry territory was renamed Puducherry, and its capital city is the city of Puducherry. This is where our main character grows up. The actual botanical garden in Pondicherry still exists and has a toy train track, but is no longer a zoo. It was the political and economic situation in India in 1977 that prompted Pi's father to move his family to Canada. The 1977 election came after the emergency Prime Minister Gandhi had imposed in 1975, which suspended democracy, clamped down on political opponents, and took control of the media. The state of emergency was called as a result of the internal disturbances as well as external threats of war. It was also during this time where many political leaders were taken into prison as political prisoners. When the fresh elections were held, these prisoners were then released. Life of Pi has been described as a fable, a religious story or parable, an adventure story, and a castaway story. Most cultures have traditional fables with anthropomorphized animals. Anthropomorphism is when we apply human characteristics to animals. For example, we present them as beings who can talk and act as if they were human. A fable is a story traditionally written for or told to children and has a moral. The animals in a fable usually represent human traits. For example, the fox represents cunning and the lamb represents innocence, while the lion could always represent pride and courage. A castaway is someone who is cast adrift or ashore, usually on an island, as a survivor of a shipwreck. There are many examples of castaway stories, both factual and fictional, such as Robinson Crusoe, the Swiss Family Robinson, Kon-Tiki, the Mutiny on the Bounty. Some of these are mentioned by Pi in chapter 63. Some castaway stories feature cannibalism. The first thing that you need to pay attention to when it comes to this novel is that the story is a story within a story. So the novel is the story of an Indian boy, Pisin Patel, who chooses to be known as Pi. The story actually has two narrators. One is an author who is referred to as the narrator, and the other narrator is the main character or protagonist, Pi Patel. The narrator speaks directly to the reader. He is partly the author himself and partly a fictitious character. His sections are in italics, so are easy to identify. He introduces us to the novel in partly fictitious author's note. His text frames the novel and connects other parts of the story as told to him by Pi. In the final part of the novel, he receives a sound recording of an interview between Japanese shipping officials and Pai and transcribes it. Through the narrator, we also have short but telling glimpses of Pai as an adult in Toronto. Essentially, the narrator acts as Pai's scribe, telling Pai's story in the first person, in his voice, and through his eyes. Pai in the story is now an adult and is speaking to the author or narrator, telling him of his life as a boy in India and then, as a teenager, of his remarkable journey across the Pacific, first in a ship that sinks and then in a lifeboat with an adult tiger. Most of the novel comprises the story that Pai tells to the narrator. The novel is broken up into 4 parts, with an author's note and then part 1, 2, and 3. This short section is at the beginning of the novel. It is important to read it. We will then also reread it at the end of the novel as well. The author's note at the beginning of a book is normally factual. This author's note is unusual because it is partly fictitious and it is an integral part of the novel. As the writer of the author's note, the author blurs the boundary between himself and the fictitious narrator, who links many of the chapters, and who writes part 3. And why does he do this? Good storytelling is an important theme of the novel, and the author makes the author's note part of a good story. Instead of telling us that he spent months researching zoos, religion, and the psychology of animals and shipwreck survivors, he tells us that he tracked down Pai and wrote down his story verbatim, a much, much better story. In part 1, which is set mainly in the early to mid-1970s, we read the account of Pai's childhood in Pondicherry in southern India, where he lives with his parents and older brother Ravi. His father runs a successful zoo. The family is educated and modern in outlook, and they live a comfortable middle-class life. When Pai is a teenager, his parents decide to immigrate to Canada. The zoo animals are sold. Pai's father arranges to ship many of them to the United States, where he can get a higher price for them. The family, with the caged animals, leaves India on a Japanese cargo ship, the Tsinsom, and heads across the Pacific. But soon after departure, Pai is woken by a loud noise in the night, and he goes out onto the deck to find that the ship is sinking. In part 2, set mainly between June 1977 and early 1978, Pai tells this astonishing story of his survival. Sailors toss Pai onto a lifeboat where he finds a zebra, a vicious hyena, an orangutan, and to his horror, an adult male tiger known as Richard Parker. Pai is the only human survivor. To stay alive, Pai himself has to supply the tiger with food and water or be eaten. During the 227 days of the journey, Pai is tested to extremes. Part 2 ends with the boat washing up on the Mexican coast. The tiger disappears into the jungle and Pai is rescued by villagers. Part 3 takes place in a hospital where Pai is recovering. He is interviewed by officials from the Japanese government who want to establish how and why the ship sank. Pai tells the officials the story of Part 2. The men do not believe it, nor do they know what to make of Pai, who seems to be more interested in food than anything else. Eventually, Pai puts it to them that they want a story that won't surprise them. So he tells a short, different story. The ship sank, he swam to a lifeboat where he found his mother, the cook, and a sailor, the only other survivors. The cook kills the sailor and Pai's mother, and Pai, whose instinct for survival is even greater than the cook's, kills and eats him. On a literal level, this is probably the story the officials believe. But when Pai asks them which they prefer, It is the story with the tiger. One of the themes of the novel is storytelling and the blurred boundaries between fact and fiction. It is left up to the reader to work out what is reality and how important it is.